Which brings me to one of our listener questions. Jim Timmerman, who is a frequent contributor to the show, was asking what was the biggest game show scandal? And it was probably it the $64,000?
In this country, it would be the $64,000 question scandal. The broader thing was it was the quiz show scandal because there were so many rigged game shows in the 1950s. And what it boiled down to was basically it hadn't occurred to the government that you would rig a game show. So there was no law regulating them at the time. And all these scandals come out and suddenly it hits the government, we should actually have a few laws regulating these. There were a lot of unethical game shows doing a lot of stuff that was not okay and was very, very sketchy behind the scenes. And they cleaned house in a matter of speaking, and the networks established these departments that would oversee game shows and come up with measures of keeping them ethical and keeping them honest. And that continues to this day. I mean, I can tell you about the processes on a lot of the game shows that I've worked on. Contestants, and I feel bad when this happens. You're asked by some game shows sometimes not to loudly trumpet what shows you're working on because they like to keep it under wraps until the press release comes out that, hey, we're doing this show, and they don't want you to announce before the press releases come out, hey, I've been working on this show for the past 2 months. So sometimes you're asked to keep the game show that you're working on under wraps while you're working on a 12-week contract for it.
Right.
So I've worked on shows where we have had to send contestants home because it turns out they knew me or they're friends of other people that work on the show. Another measure that game show use very often is randomization, which is we prepare too much material for the game, and then we use random drawings before the show starts to decide which one we'll use for each episode that we tape that day. So we'll come in knowing that we're going to tape 5 episodes, and we'll bring in 6 or 7 stacks of material. And we do a random drawing where we decide, okay, the material in this envelope is what we're going to use for game 1. The material in this envelope is what we're going to use for game 2. And that way you can't really give any of the contestants any help ahead of time because that's out of everyone's hands. Nobody knew in advance what material was going to be used for their games.
I never thought about that, yeah. Another listener question, Mr. Chris Hughes, who's stalking you on Facebook. Again, let us know if it becomes a problem.
We've got people.
He wants to know, what will the legacy be for Barker's Beauties?
The legacy for Barker's Beauties, it's kind of a strange thing because, they were considered just kind of part of the package at the time. There's stuff about The Price is Right that hasn't aged well. For example, reach into my pockets and find the $100 bill.
You can't do that anymore.
Yeah, you can't do that anymore.
Especially when you put it in your pants pocket.
Yeah. But what was interesting was every now and then Bob would it was one of the pricing games that didn't take a lot of time to play. Like there was a game called Most Expensive. That's a very, very fast game. And very often Bob would round up the models and just have a chat with them after playing Most Expensive to fill a little time and get a sense of some personality out of them. He would ask the question, what do you want for Christmas? What's going on in your life? And just a very broad question that would get some answers out of them and give them a little sign of life. And I do appreciate that about the old era of game shows. As much as there's some baked-in sexism in a lot of old media, and definitely game shows were not immune to that, I do appreciate that Bob did that. He did give the models some kind of personality and give us a chance to know them. It's interesting how The Price is Right had a rotation of many, many models over the years. They came and went. But there are 3 that I think are probably the 3 that Chris is referring to as Barker's Beauties, which were Diane Parkinson, Holly Hallstrom, and Janice Pennington, who were like the varsity squad of the models because they were there for years and years and years.
Yeah, Holly was my favorite.
And they were as much of that show as Bob was.
Yeah. All I know is the microphone with the really long stem with the ball in there.
Yeah.
A Sony ECM51 telescoping model, for those of you who are shopping on eBay.
Was Bob Barker's microphone longer than Gene Rayburn's?
Oh.
And I'm talking about microphones.
Okay.
I'm talking about microphones. Yeah. I'm not this isn't a euphemism.
Yeah.
It was the same microphone. Gene was using a feature of the microphone that Bob didn't use.
Okay.
That's the reason it's called a telescoping model, because you could pull it like a telescope and elongate it. And Gene liked to have it that way because it enabled more physical humor. He could wave it like a baton, or he could toss it like a javelin. He would do physical shtick with the microphone being really long.
He could smack people in the head.
Yeah.
He could smack Fanny Flagg upside the face with it.
Yeah. So Bob kept it short. Gene kept it long, but ultimately their microphones were the same length. And I have photos of them in the dressing room comparing to verify that.
Wow.
Okay. Was it in Diane's contract that she always brought the mic out to him? Did the other girls hate her because wait, is that bitch?
No, the one that usually brought the microphone was Janice. Janice was somehow the one. Yeah, Janice was the one that was always on microphone duty.
Get your own.
Did he have a contract that just said I can't walk out with a microphone? It has to be brought to me.
And honestly, I don't think I've watched it once with Drew Carey, and I really like Drew Carey. But I mean, he appears to be good on the show. Does he have someone bring him a mic too, or? I know he kept the have your pet spayed or neutered.
I would think it would come down from the ceiling, like the Let's Get Ready to Rumble guy.
Well, the interesting thing, Drew,
badass, wouldn't it?
Drew has a lav mic and a handheld mic now.
Okay.
Oddly enough, and I think some of the old traditions are still going. I do kind of like the microphone and the handoff, just because again, it's a chance to give you a chance to see the entire cast of the show, so to speak.
Yeah.
Drew starts the show by saying hi to the model, who hands him the microphone, and then he turns around and says hi to George Gray, the announcer, and the camera pans over to George. So you get to see the whole family before the show starts, and I do like that. I like that they've changed it and expanded it a little bit to include the announcer that way.
Steve Farrell has a two-part question. He wants to know, Dear Adam, if you could bring back a canceled game show, what would it be, and what popular game show do you simply not get? Like, is there one that you're like, why does anybody watch this crap?
A canceled game show that I would love to bring back. On a personal level, I wish Nickelodeon would bring back Double Dare, because I worked on that show for 2 seasons and had the time of my life working on that show.
Yeah.
Just absolutely adored it. And then, if I can give 2 answers here, there's a show that I think would be a perpetual choice to bring back, because it would always have a space to fill on the television landscape. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego?
Where is she?
Anything that makes learning fun. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a good memory of my childhood watching that show, but just the most fantastic use of guest stars and music and sketch comedy to present questions in a way that was more engaging than just asking a trivia question, and instilling a little geographic knowledge into the contestants. And it was a showcase for smart kids. That's the other thing. You have all these kids that, you don't get the reward for, if you're not cut out for basketball or football in school. Here's a game show where you can win a trip to Orlando or wherever else you want for knowing geography and for excelling in geography.
Yeah, cool.
And just any outlet like that is worth something. So those would be my 2 picks. As far as game shows that you don't, I'm very cautious about answering a question like that, and I'll tell you why. And it has nothing to do personally. A friend of mine was quoting Dan Enright. He's a guy named Mark Maxwell Smith who worked on a lot of game shows, and he quoted Dan Enright, from Jack Barry and Dan Enright Productions, the people who did Wheel of Fortune and Tic Tac Doe. Dan Enright gathered his staff around one day to watch television with him. And the point of this exercise was Dan was giving them notes on the game show that they were watching, which was not one of their game shows, but he was breaking down point by point why this is a bad show and why it's just awful and how it's not going to last 13 weeks because they're making this mistake, it's being presented this way, and that's wrong. It should be presented this other way. And so he was just rattling off all the things the show was doing wrong. Well, the show was Wheel of Fortune. He was giving the staff this lecture on how bad Wheel of Fortune is, and it was like 5 months into the run of Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah, right.
And what Mark said was all that accomplished was the longer Dan Enright lived, the longer Wheel of Fortune stayed on the air, the dumber he looked for making us listen to that lecture on why Wheel of Fortune was bad.
Yeah.
So I stay away from that stuff because it reminds me, there is an audience for stuff, and maybe even if you don't see it, some other viewer sees something in it that you're not getting out of it.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm always very cautious with criticism because, maybe there's something that I'm not seeing.
One of the movie producers had sent a heartfelt letter to Steven Spielberg on how he just can't agree with them calling the movie Back to the Future, and that this was wrong, and this was wrong, and that he just really believes that there's so many things that they should not put in the movie, and the way it was going was not, and the guy was clearly out of his mind. And then, if you look, there's a TV critic who just gave the Beatles, and Mike, I know you hate the Beatles, but he gave their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, just gave them the worst review. Their music is horrible, and their performance, and this and that, and he doesn't see them amounting to much in the future.
Well, yeah, and one of the right when Bruce Springsteen began to take off in the 1970s, he was on the cover of Time magazine, and one of the letters to the editor that Time got after publishing that issue is, why are we putting this guy on the cover when we're not going to remember who he is 6 months ago?
Oh yeah, there you go.
So again, that's one of the tricky things about criticism is you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know where somebody's career is going to take them. You don't know how a TV show is going to evolve. You don't know the next step in the story here.
Well, it's been 50 minutes since we talked about U2. I'll bring them up again. When we went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they had their rejection letters in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which was awesome to see.
Was it RCA Records that turned them down?
Yeah, I don't remember, but there were a few of them up there. Yeah. I have what some may consider a stupid question. It's more of a statement, I guess.
Okay.
So was it Chuck Barris? Is that the guy, the Gong Show
Host
guy?
of the Gong Show.
Yes.
Okay, so I remember there being this conspiracy thing, and I watched a documentary on it that he killed people.
Yes.
He's a hitman. He was a spy. The documentary. Well, hold on.
Okay.
So this does have a point.
Okay.
So the documentary just was going through all this stuff about it, and it was a big secret, and they would have interviews with people that were like, yeah, he's totally a spy, and this is awesome, and then interviews with people being like, that's crazy, you're out of your mind, and they were really invested in it. And then every once in a while you would see something on social media like, he did these awesome things, and no, he didn't, and blah, blah, blah. And then years later, Christopher Lee, Lord of the Rings, Saruman.
Yes.
It comes out that he was like basically what James Bond was based on, or one of the ideas was that James Bond was based on him. He was an assassin. He did all these amazing things. Everybody's like, yeah, he did that.
Right.
Yeah, he totally did that. I'm like, why are you so impressed or freaked out by Chuck Barris? But when it comes to Saruman, you're like, yeah, he totally murdered people and like flew in helicopters hanging on by his teeth. It's what he did. He's Saruman.
I think it's because you can see Christopher Lee doing that.
But you can picture that a lot more easily than you can picture Chuck Barris.
Well, because Chuck Barris,
it's just true.
I like to imagine that Chuck wore like his frilly tuxedo shirt.
Yes. Oh yeah,
you know, the big floppy hat when he killed people.
But, well, you want to get on their
stuff. And Gene the dancing machine.
Yeah, you want to look like you're not a threat. You know,
Chuck Barris came and said. He told everybody that he did. It was true. It was absolutely true.
Yeah.
And then, 10 years later, I don't know what you're talking about. So, I mean, no one knows.
But it's
I bet Adam knows. Adam knows
this is... I have a book forthcoming. Actually, the next book that I have coming out is The History of the Gong Show.
Okay.
And I had the chance to talk to Chuck's staff, all of whom were just completely amused by that book when it first came out. And they saw their boss confessing to being a CIA hitman. And they said, if you were an employee of the company, if you were one of this man's employees, there was one detail in his story that completely tipped it that this was bull, because the idea was he created the dating game as a cover because you would travel with the couple as a chaperone to wherever they want a trip to. And that was where he was carrying out the murders. I was chaperoning these people, and then...
Like Tony Soprano,
part of Chuck's story.
Like taking Meadow to college, and I'm going to ice this guy over here. And then...
Exactly, yeah, that was basically Chuck's story. And what Chuck staffers all said was Chuck never, ever chaperoned the dates because he was the boss of the production company. He had other stuff to do. And basically the chaperone for the dates on the dating game was the duty that was always assigned to the newest employee, because that was how they gauged whether or not you knew what you were doing. Because it was a completely do-nothing assignment where a bad thing could possibly happen. So you basically need to keep one eye open and keep one eye on it.
Yeah.
So basically, it was the newest hire at the company who had the job of chaperoning the dates on the dating game. And it was just your test to make sure that that you weren't going to eat crayons at your desk or anything.
The red
so no,
one
it wasn't
delicious.
Chuck. But the other thing that I appreciate was a couple of his staffers told me, but, because his staffers loved him, just across the board, nobody who worked for Chuck had a bad word to say about him. They all loved having him as a boss. And what a couple of his staffers told me was, we all knew this was crap, but just because we loved the guy so much, we would keep the lie going for him. If somebody walked up to one of Chuck Barris' staffers and said, hey, I read that book about Chuck Barris being a murderer. You worked for the guy. Is that true? And he says, yeah, that's not true. That can't possibly be true. Chuck, the only weird thing about Chuck was he would always disappear on Thursday to fly to Europe. Wait, what? Yeah. Chuck would always disappear on Thursdays to fly to Europe. And that was, well, wait a minute, what part of Europe? And he said, well, I remember there was one time it was a small town in Sweden. It's like, Chuck, why are you going to a small town in Sweden? But that was the only real quirk he had. Oh, also, he had this really weird gun in the top drawer of his desk. And I don't know why he had this weird gun, but I had never seen one like, oh my God. And so.
2 and 2 together.
Yeah.
Well, listen, and Adam, don't let me tell you how to do your job. But when you write the book about the history of the Gong Show, please tell me that you're not going to include the Dave Attell reboot of it. Please.
I imagine that
I am a Dave Attell fan. I think I've seen every episode of Insomniac with Dave Attell. I've met Dave Attell. I have Dave Attell's autograph. He is hilarious, one of the greatest stand-up comics at all. But he, on the 1 to 10 scale of not giving a about doing a show, he passed up Louis Anderson. But he was like in the 30s. I mean, he could not care less about hosting the new Gong Show. It was really bad. Because I was psyched out of my mind when I heard they were redoing it with Dave Attell, and I watched. I'm like, God.
Well, the thing that you kind of start to realize is they've attempted to bring the Gong Show back a few times. They've a DJ named Don Blue hosted it for a year in the 1980s, and then they did it on Game Show Network with George Gray hosting it. And as you watch these revivals, what you come to realize is the secret ingredient to the Gong Show was Chuck Barris.
Yeah,
like he was so much of the flavor and the identity that even if you have people who really care about what they're doing and really want to do it right, and from what I can glean, the most recent revival of it on ABC fits that. It was made by people who really did care about the show and really wanted to do a good/great revival of the Gong Show. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, if you don't have Chuck, and unfortunately the passage of linear time means we will never have Chuck again.
Right.
You don't have the Gong Show because he was so much of that show's identity, and he was so woven into his own creation that you can't really do it and have it be the same if he's not there.
And I look forward to every single appearance by Gene the Dancing Machine. I don't know why. I just ate that up. I absolutely just loved it.
And now it's time for Dave's Comedy Corner. I wonder what Adam and Eve thought the first time the leaves changed color. It's like,
hey, what happened?
What the hell's wrong with all these trees? What did we do this time? Thank you very much. I'll be here all week. This has been Dave's Comedy Corner.
Ah, waka waka waka.
This episode is going to drop on the 22nd, just a few days before Thanksgiving. And no spoilers, but I noticed on your Facebook page that you went to the re-release in theaters of the greatest Thanksgiving movie ever, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I just want, don't spoil it, but how great was, because you said it was like 15 minutes of deleted scenes were in the theatrical release.
Oh.
How cool was it seeing new stuff?
I've never seen a guy get picked up by his testicles before.
Here's the thing. It was really cool, and here's the thing. It's not 15 minutes of deleted scenes. It's a 15-minute deleted scene.
Oh.
There is one incredibly long scene that got whittled down in the final cut, but it's when Steve Martin first boards the plane and ends up sitting next to Del, and it's great and it's funny, and I get the impression that it's partly improvised by John Candy, but it's Del just telling the entire story of his career as a shower curtain ring salesman.
Oh my God!
And it goes on forever, and you see Steve Martin just growing more and more aggravated, and the story goes and goes and goes, and there's no point to it. And as you're watching it, I can absolutely understand why this got deleted. I can see why they cut this out, but it adds a lot more depth to the scene later where Steve Martin just finally loses it
in the hotel.
You're like a chatty
Cathy. Lets him have it.
Because that's always
pull your own string.
That scene's always bothered me a bit because it makes him look like he's just a cruel person. But
here's an idea. Have a point.
In fact, if you do some Googling around, you can find the original shooting script for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. The original, as I understand it, the original cut was 3 hours long.
I thought it was over. I thought it was like 3:30 or
It was a massive movie, and so the original screenplay is now out there, so you can read the screenplay, and it's recommended reading because it's a very entertaining script just in general. It's a fun read.
Yeah.
But also it adds a lot more clarity. Like my roommate and I were talking about how the final scene didn't make sense to us for years and years and years because we didn't understand why Steve Martin's wife would be crying when she sees John Candy walk in for Thanksgiving dinner.
Right.
And when you read the screenplay, oh my God, it turns out that the wife is a much bigger character in the original screenplay.
Yeah.
And you learn a lot more of her story, and you come to understand why she gets so emotional at seeing John Candy for the first time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's absolutely worth Googling and seeking this out. It's a great read, and it's, like I said, it lends a lot more depth and a lot more dimension to the movie that you watch every year at Thanksgiving.
Yeah. And I was going to ask this question, and Mike, you can jump in and answer this too. But when I was in high school and this movie came out, a friend of mine, he went to see it over the weekend.
Okay.
And he was telling me Monday that it was great, and this is great, and this is great. And spoiler alert, he's like, yeah, and John Candy doesn't have a family and something else. I'm like, what? Shut up. Yeah. So he totally spoiled the movie for me. And has anyone, Adam, has anyone ever like totally spoiled something for you like that? I mean, it was still a great movie, but I'm watching the whole thing knowing that this is why this poor son of a bitch is acting this way.
Yeah.
And I just knew. Yeah. I just inherently knew. And
there's been a trend in the last couple of years of primetime game shows where the network promos give you a heads up that a lot of money is going to be won on the upcoming episode. And I don't care for that.
Yeah.
Deal or No Deal gave away $1 million win in a promo once. And a few other shows have done that. It's like, no, it's...
Why would you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've noticed that Rings of Power partially got spoiled for me. Mm-hmm. Just a little ad on Facebook. So I'm innocently scrolling on Facebook, and all of a sudden there's a picture of a character and it said, identity finally revealed. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. I know, without spoiling Rings of Power too much,
right?
You know that one or two characters are going to be revealed at the end. You just don't know who they are. You know who they are, but you don't know which characters it is. And it was a picture of one of the characters. Like, well, now I know that this character is one of those two characters.
Right. Yeah, if you don't watch The Walking Dead, you can't go on. If you miss an episode of Walking Dead, you can't go on Twitter the next day because Glenn will be trending. I'm like, oh, what happened?
Well,
to Glenn?
That's the other thing. You guys are in the Eastern time zone, so you don't suffer with this. But on the Pacific time zone, everybody who lives in this time zone just knows you have to stay off social media for about 3 or 4 hours before the broadcasting of anything that you want to see.
Right.
Because your friends on the East Coast may mean well, but it's, the first time that the new version of Pyramid with Michael Strahan, the first time they had $100,000 win, I had it spoiled for me.
Yeah.
So, it's... People don't mean harm, but when you live on the Pacific time zone, you do have to train yourself to stay away from social media on the day of a thing that you care about.
Yeah.